So what did the early church have to say about slavery? Well, St. Paul addresses himself to this on several occasions. Colossians, Ephesians, Titus, 1 Corinthians. In all of those four instances, he has this phrase, more or less the same, telling slaves to obey their masters. So, slaves, obey your masters. Be docile. Do what they tell you to do. Don't rebel. Don't be someone who is subversive. Just obey your masters. So that's the indication that he gives them. He also tells masters to treat their slaves justly and fairly. So he's obviously directing himself to Christian slave owners. So Paul knew that they were Christians who owned slaves. He does not tell them to free their slaves clearly, but he simply tells them to treat their slaves well. Now he would say that perhaps he seems to undermine slavery when he says in Galatians, "For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, you are all one in Christ Jesus." And also in Colossians, in chapter 3, he says, "Here there cannot be Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free man, but Christ is all and in all." Now in those two passages, though, Paul is not really calling for the abolition of slavery. The point that he's making in the larger context is that now everyone has access to salvation. The salvation won by Christ is now available for everyone. It's no longer just for the Jews, for the original chosen people. It's now the new people of God, and everyone has access to that. Whether you are a slave or free, whether you are a master or slave, whether you're a woman or man, Jew or Gentile, now salvation is open to everyone. That's the point that he's trying to make. It was not considered by anyone at that time that he was calling for the abolition of slavery, but simply that he was explaining that now in the church itself there are no distinctions. In his epistle to Philemon, he sends back a runaway slave to Philemon. He has converted this slave and he's baptized him. And he encourages Philemon to receive him back. He says, no longer as a slave, but as a brother, implying that he would like Philemon to free him. But that, again, was not interpreted by the early church as a mandate to abolish slavery. As I was saying this afternoon about the roles of men and women in the family, the husband and wife, the early Christians were not really social revolutionaries. St. Paul also tells the Romans to obey the pagan government of Rome, which was terribly unjust in many ways. But in spite of those injustices, he tells them, obey your masters, obey your rulers, those who are set over you. So slavery was considered part of the social order. And so up until the 11th century, the church did not engage in a generalized effort to Christianize and reform the social and political order. Starting in the 11th century, there's a deeper understanding of the incarnation, of the fact that Christ has assumed all human realities, and what St. Paul really meant by restoring all things in Christ. And so there was an effort, beginning with the reforming post in the 11th century and continuing right through to our day, of an effort to change the culture, to change the society, to make it more Christian, and to not just to consider ourselves Christians as foreigners, wayfarers in a hostile world, but to try to bring the world back to Christ. So that's that effort. It really started only in the 11th century. Up until that time, the church concerned itself with the salvation of souls, individual souls. And it was thought that we were in a hostile world, an unjust world, and so what we had to do was to try to seek holiness ourselves in that world. The more holy people would go off and become monks and into monasteries, but the idea of really changing the legislation and changing the political order was not in the minds of Christians of the early church. So the church did not try at the beginning to abolish slavery. What it did do during the first millennium was to change the perception of the slave so that he was no longer considered a chattel, a piece of property. He was considered a human being with rights. And that was probably the greatest and most radical revolution, if you want, in all of social history. the slave became a human person with rights and no longer a thing. And that was a great achievement of the early church. I'm going to go now into some of the ways in which this was felt. Because the teaching of the church about loving one another, about the golden rule, it was incompatible with the kind of slavery that the Roman Empire was practicing. What did the church do then? Well, once the slave was considered a human being, then a Christian who was a slave owner had to treat him in a different way. He couldn't put him to death, that was murder. He couldn't treat him unfairly or cruelly, because that was a lack of charity towards one's slave. Since fornication was considered a sin, as was prostitution, the slave owner could no longer take advantage of his slave sexually, nor could he put them out to prostitution. That was clearly immoral. He could no longer do that. The church insisted that the slaves had a right to worship. They had the right to be baptized. They had access to salvation like everyone else, to baptize, and to go to church. And within the church itself, the master and the slave were brothers. There was no distinctions within the church. So the master and the slave were considered as brothers, and that had a tremendous effect on slave owners who, inside the building, the church building, and worship, they realized, well, this is, he's my brother. He might even be my boss, because there were slaves who were priests and bishops. 2 popes, in fact, were former slaves. And so within the church itself, those distinctions disappeared. And so when you went out of the church again back to work, to ordinary life, well, that had an effect on you. You had been with this slave of yours, and he was an equal within the church, and so the way you were going to treat him was going to change. In Catholic cemeteries, there was no mention of the status of the deceased. In pagan burial grounds, it always mentioned whether he was a senator or an aristocrat or a patrician or a slave, whereas in Christian burial grounds that was never mentioned. So you don't know whether someone was a slave or not. The church insisted also that the slave had a basic right to marry and to form a family, and that family could not be broken up by selling off one of the children or one of the spouses. So again, for the first time, slaves acquired the right to have a family, which they did not have in the Roman Empire under Roman law. They had the right to marry, to have children, and that family had to stay together. A Christian slave owner could not sell off one or the other member of the family. The church also insisted that the slave had a right to own property, that was a basic human right, that the laborer was worthy of his hire, so he had a right to some rest also. So he couldn't be overworked. The owner must not force him to work in such a way as to endanger his health. So in all these different ways, little by little, what the church was doing was changing the perception of slavery, so that in the end you had someone who had a right to the slave's work, but he did not have the right over the person of the slave. That was basically abolished, not by a grandiose gesture or a rebellion, but simply by a changing of the perception of what the slave was, a human being with rights rather than a thing. As I mentioned, 2 popes were former slaves, Pius I and Calixtus I. Now, you also had the problem, what about slaves who were not owned by Christian owners and who were being taken advantage of? And that was also dealt with by the early church fathers. We have a document called the Apostolic Tradition around the year 215 AD, normally attributed to St. Hippolytus, and it states that in those cases, the people in question, women who are being taken advantage of by their masters, for example, sexually, they also have the right to baptism and to worship. It's not, as long as it's a material cooperation and they are not in agreement with that. But they're obeying their owners in those things, and so they're also allowed to be in the church, and they're baptized and to attend church mass.